courtroom was quiet, but it was not a peaceful quiet. It was the kind of silence that came from boredom and routine. People had been sitting there for hours, listening to cases that sounded the same. Papers were shuffled. Someone cleared their throat. The ceiling fan moved slowly, pushing warm air around the room. Everyone wanted the day to end. At the center of the room stood a little boy. He barely reached the height of the wooden stand in front of him. His feet did not fully touch the ground, so they swung slightly, though he tried to keep them still. His hands were clasped together so tightly that his fingers looked pale. His eyes stayed down, fixed on a small crack in the floor. He was not dressed like the others. His shirt was clean but old. The color faded from too many washes. The sleeves were a bit too long, covering part of his hands. His shoes were scuffed, with one lace replaced by a knot of string. He looked like someone who had learned early how to make things last longer than they should. The judge sat high above him, flipping through a thin file. It was a small case, nothing serious, nothing that would make the news. The judge had already seen dozens like it that week. The boy had been brought in for causing a disturbance, or so the report said. The words were dry and simple, offering no real story, just a summary. The judge sighed and looked down at the child. His voice carried across the room, sharp from fatigue rather than anger. "Stop squandering our time," the judge said. "Speak clearly and explain why you're here." The words felt heavy in the air. A few people shifted in their seats. Someone in the back let out a quiet breath, half amused, half annoyed. To them, this was just another delay in a long day. The boy opened his mouth, then closed it again. His throat felt tight. Words were always hard for him, especially when so many eyes were watching. He tried to speak, but only a soft sound came out. His shoulders rose and fell as he took a breath. I didn't mean to," he finally said, barely above a whisper. The judge leaned back slightly, rubbing his temple. He had heard that phrase too many times. Everyone claimed they didn't mean to. Everyone had an excuse. "Didn't mean to what?" the judge asked, his tone flat. The boy swallowed. His eyes flicked toward the floor again. I was trying to help," he said. That answer caused a small ripple of quiet murmurs. The clerk typed something quickly. The officer standing near the door crossed his arms, looking unconvinced. The judge glanced at the file again. According to the report, the boy had entered a public building without permission and caused a disruption during an event. It sounded simple enough. Wrong place, wrong time. Helping how? The judge asked. The boy hesitated. He knew his answer would sound strange. It always did. Adults never understood it the way he felt it. There was too much noise, he said. People were upset. I thought if I played, it would calm them down. A few eyebrows lifted in the room. Someone let out a small laugh before quickly stopping. The judge looked up, his expression firm. Played what? The boy shifted in place. His hands tightened together again. The keys, he said. The judge frowned slightly. What keys? The piano, the boy replied. For a moment, the courtroom was silent again, but this time it carried confusion. The judge closed the file and rested his hands on the desk. This report doesn't mention a piano, he said. The boy nodded. It was there, in the hall. No one was using it. The judge exhaled slowly. His patience was thinning. To him, this sounded like a child avoiding responsibility by telling a story. So you wandered into a restricted area and started playing an instrument during an official event? The boy shook his head quickly. I didn't wander. I heard crying. I thought music might help. The words came out rushed now, as if he feared being cut off. His voice trembled, not from fear of punishment, but from the fear of not being understood. The judge looked around the room. No one seemed impressed. A few people checked the time. The case felt like it was dragging. You need to understand, the judge said, leaning forward, that this court does not have time for games. Actions have rules. You can't just decide to do whatever you want. The boy nodded, though his eyes were wet now. He understood rules. He just didn't always understand people. I'm sorry, he said quietly. The judge paused, studying the child more closely for the first time. There was something unusual in the boy's posture. He wasn't defiant. He wasn't careless. He looked worn, like someone who carried more weight than a child should. Still, the judge had a courtroom to run. "Where are your parents?" the judge asked. The boy hesitated again. His fingers loosened slightly, then tightened once more. "I don't have them here," he said. That answer landed differently. The room shifted again, this time more subtly. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" "They work far," the boy replied. "And sometimes they don't come back." The judge didn't respond right away. He looked back at the file, then at the boy. There was no guardian listed, only a temporary address. The judge cleared his throat. "This court still has to decide what to do," he said. "Good intentions don't erase poor judgment." The boy nodded again. He expected that. Adults always said things like that. He glanced toward the side of the room, where a piano sat against the wall. It was old, its surface dull with dust. Most people probably forgot it was even there. To him, it felt loud, like it was calling out. He took a small step forward before thinking, then stopped himself. "Sir," he said softly. The judge looked up, clearly ready to end the conversation. "What is it now?" The boy took a breath. His heart beat fast, but his voice was steadier than before. "Can I show you?" he asked. The judge frowned. "Show me what?" "What I meant," the boy said. "Why I did it." A murmur spread across the room. The judge glanced at the clock. This was exactly the kind of delay he hated. "We are not here for performances," the judge said. "I know," the boy replied. "Just 1 minute." The judge studied the child again. Something about the way he stood now felt different. He was still small, still nervous, but there was a quiet certainty in his eyes. The judge leaned back, torn between irritation and curiosity. He tapped his fingers on the desk. 1 minute, he finally said. "And then this ends." The boy's eyes widened slightly. He nodded quickly, afraid the permission might disappear if he moved too slowly. He turned toward the piano, each step feeling heavier than the last, unaware that in that moment, the entire room had begun to lean forward, even if they didn't yet know why. The boy walked toward the piano slowly, but the sound of the courtroom faded from his mind. In his head, he was no longer standing in front of strangers. He was somewhere else, somewhere quieter. That place was where his story really began. He had grown up in a small home where walls were thin and days were long. The rooms were often silent, not because people were calm, but because everyone was tired. His parents worked whenever they could, sometimes day, sometimes night. Some days they came home late. Other days they didn't come home at all. When they were there, they spoke little, saving their energy for the next shift. The boy learned early how to be alone without feeling lonely. He learned how to listen. He listened to footsteps outside, to voices through walls, to the hum of old machines. Sounds filled the spaces where words were missing. School was hard for him, not because he couldn't learn, but because he struggled to explain himself. Teachers often thought he wasn't paying attention. Other children thought he was strange. When noise grew too loud, his head felt full, like too many thoughts were pushing against each other. He didn't know how to say that. He only knew how to escape it. That escape came one afternoon by accident. He had been waiting for his parents in a public building after school. The place was old, with long halls and high ceilings. His backpack was heavy, and his legs ached from standing too long. As he wandered, he heard a sound that didn't belong to the building. It was soft, uneven, like someone touching something carefully. He followed the sound until he found a piano sitting near a wall. A few keys were chipped. Some didn't sound right, but to him it was beautiful. A cleaner nearby was pressing keys without rhythm, just passing time. When the cleaner walked away, the sound stopped, leaving the air empty. The boy stood there, staring. He had never touched a piano before. He didn't know how it worked, but something pulled him forward. Slowly, he lifted one finger and pressed a key. The sound echoed through the hall. It felt warm, like a voice answering him. He pressed another. Then another. The sounds didn't make a song at first. They were scattered, uncertain. But the boy listened closely. He noticed which sounds felt heavy and which felt light. He noticed how pressing harder changed the feeling. Minutes passed without him realizing it. For the first time in a long while, his head felt quiet. From that day on, he returned whenever he could. Sometimes the building was empty. Sometimes people passed by without noticing him. He never played loudly. He never wanted attention. He just wanted the calm that came when his fingers touched the keys. Music became the place where he could speak without words. When he was sad, the notes slowed. When he was scared, they shook. When he felt hope, they lifted. He didn't know the names of the sounds, but he knew their meaning. At home, there was no piano. Sometimes he tapped rhythms on the table. Sometimes he imagined keys beneath his hands as he lay in bed. He remembered the sounds, replaying them in his mind like a story he could return to whenever the world felt too loud. The day of the incident came suddenly. He had followed his parent to a large public event being held in a government building. The halls were crowded. Voices overlapped. Shoes echoed sharply on the floor. The boy's head began to ache as the noise grew stronger. He tried to stay close, but he was pushed aside by the moving crowd. That was when he heard crying. It was faint, almost lost under the noise, but he recognized it. He followed the sound, weaving through people until he found a small group standing near the hall where the piano sat. Someone had knocked into a display. A child nearby was upset. Adults were arguing about responsibility. The boy saw the piano and felt a familiar pull. Without thinking too much, he slipped away from the crowd and sat down. He began to play. At first, people didn't notice. The noise drowned him out. But he kept going, choosing notes that felt steady. Slowly, the music rose above the chaos. Voices softened. Movements slowed. Even the crying faded. For a brief moment, the hall felt different. Lighter. Calmer. But not everyone saw it that way. An official rushed over, annoyed and confused. The music stopped abruptly. The boy was told he wasn't allowed to be there. His explanation came out broken and unclear. To the adults around him, it sounded like an excuse. By the time his parent returned, security had already been called. The situation grew bigger than it ever needed to be. The boy stayed quiet, shrinking into himself as voices rose again. Now, standing in the courtroom, all of that felt far away and very close at the same time. As he reached the piano, his hands trembled slightly. This piano felt different. It wasn't the one from the hall, but it looked similar enough. Dust covered the top. The bench creaked as he sat down. He glanced back once. People were watching now. Even those who had looked bored before seemed curious. The judge sat still, arms crossed, waiting. The boy placed his hands on the keys but didn't press them yet. For a moment, fear returned. What if the sounds didn't come? What if this piano didn't understand him the way the others did? His breathing grew shallow. Then he remembered the quiet. He remembered the way music made space in his head. He closed his eyes and let his fingers move. The first note rang out, clear and soft. Then another. The sounds were careful at first, like steps on thin ice. But as the notes filled the room, his hands steadied. The music grew warmer, deeper. It wasn't fast. It wasn't fancy. It was honest. Each sound carried something he had never been able to explain. Long nights, empty rooms, waiting, hoping. The courtroom didn't feel like a courtroom anymore. The walls seemed farther away. The air felt still. The boy played the way he always did, not for attention, not to impress, but to breathe. And without realizing it, he began to tell his story to everyone listening. The sound of the piano moved through the room slowly, like a breath everyone had been holding without knowing it. At first, people shifted in their seats, unsure of what they were hearing. It wasn't loud. It wasn't perfect. But it was real, and that made it hard to ignore. The boy sat still except for his hands. His feet no longer swung. His shoulders relaxed as the notes began to flow. Each key press seemed to steady him, as if the piano was grounding him to the floor. The judge watched closely, though he didn't realize it at first. His eyes had been fixed on the desk, but they slowly lifted. The tapping of his fingers stopped. He leaned forward just a little, enough to hear better. This was not the kind of sound the judge expected. He had imagined noise, maybe something clumsy and distracting. Instead, the music felt careful, thoughtful, carried weight without being heavy. Around the room, faces changed. The officer near the door loosened his crossed arms. The clerk stopped typing. Someone in the back wiped their eyes without fully understanding why. The room that had once felt tired now felt awake. The boy didn't look at anyone. His eyes stayed on the keys, watching his fingers move. He wasn't thinking about the judge anymore. He wasn't thinking about the case. He was following a feeling, the same one that had guided him every time he played. The music rose and fell like a quiet story. Some parts felt slow, almost unsure. Other parts lifted gently, like hope peeking through a window. There were pauses too, moments of silence that felt just as important as the sound. The judge felt something shift inside him. He didn't want to admit it, but the music reminded him of things he had buried under years of routine. Long hours, short patience, forgotten reasons for why he had chosen this work in the first place. He glanced at the boy's file again, but the words on the page no longer mattered the same way. They felt flat compared to what he was hearing. The boy's hands moved with growing confidence now. His fingers pressed the keys as if they knew exactly where to go. He wasn't copying anything. He wasn't performing. He was releasing something that had been trapped for a long time. In the audience, people leaned forward. No one checked their phone. No one whispered. Even the air seemed still, as if the room itself was listening. The judge noticed the boy's hands were small. Too small to carry what the music held. That realization struck him harder than the sound itself. This child had found a way to speak without asking permission, and the court had almost taken that away. The music softened. The boy slowed, letting the final notes stretch. He held the last sound for just a moment longer, then lifted his hands from the keys. Silence followed. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't empty. It was full, like the quiet after someone tells the truth. The boy sat frozen, unsure of what to do next. His chest rose and fell quickly. For a second, fear crept back in. He wondered if he had done something wrong again. The judge cleared his throat, but no words came right away. He looked around the room. Everyone was watching him now. The judge stood. That simple action broke the spell. The boy turned slowly on the bench, his hands gripping the edge. "Thank you," the judge said, his voice lower than before. The boy blinked, surprised. "You may sit," the judge added gently. The boy slid off the bench and stood near the piano, unsure where he belonged now. The officer motioned for him to return to the front, but did so without the earlier stiffness. The judge took a breath. "This court often deals with actions," he said, "but sometimes we forget to look at reasons." He looked directly at the boy. "You said you were trying to help," the judge continued, "and I believe you." A quiet sound moved through the room. Not quite applause, not quite a sigh. The boy's eyes filled, but he didn't cry. He simply nodded. The judge glanced at the clerk. "Is there any record of damage?" "No, sir," the clerk replied. "No property damage reported." The judge nodded again. He thought for a moment longer, then spoke. "This case will not move forward," he said. "The court sees no reason for punishment." The boy didn't fully understand the words at first. He looked around, confused. "You're free to go," the officer said quietly. The boy stood still, as if waiting for someone to stop him. When no one did, he took a small step back. Then another. Before leaving, he turned once more toward the piano. His fingers twitched, as if saying goodbye. The judge noticed. "Music can be powerful," the judge said, "but it needs care, guidance." The boy listened closely. "There are places where you can play," the judge added, "where it's welcomed." The boy nodded again, hope flickering across his face. As he walked toward the exit, the room felt different than when he had entered. Lighter, kinder. The judge watched him leave, then sat down slowly. He stared at the bench where the boy had been standing just minutes before. The court moved on to the next case. Papers shuffled again. Voices returned. But something had changed. The judge knew it. And so did everyone else who had listened. Some moments pass quickly. Others stay. This one stayed. The boy stepped out of the courtroom and into the hallway, the door closing softly behind him. The sound echoed for a moment, then faded. He stood there, unsure what to do next. His hands felt empty now that they were no longer on the keys. His heart was still beating fast, but the fear had softened into something else. Relief, maybe, or hope. The hallway smelled of old paper and floor cleaner. People walked past him, some in a hurry, some slowing down to glance at him before moving on. A few faces held gentle smiles. Others looked thoughtful, as if they had just witnessed something they couldn't quite explain. An officer approached him, but this time there was no stiffness in his walk. "Someone will come get you," the officer said calmly. "You can sit here." The boy nodded and sat on a wooden bench against the wall. His feet still didn't touch the ground. He stared at his shoes, tracing the worn edges with his eyes. Everything felt quieter than before, even though the building was still full. Inside the courtroom, the judge struggled to focus on the next case. The words being spoken blurred together. He heard them, but they didn't land the way they used to. His mind kept returning to the sound of the piano and the look on the boy's face while he played. He had seen many people stand before him over the years. Angry people, careless people, people who knew exactly how to speak to get what they wanted. But the boy hadn't tried to convince anyone. He had simply shared something true. That truth lingered. The judge finally raised his hand and paused the proceedings. The room stilled again, though this time it wasn't from boredom. "We'll take a short break," he said. As people stood and began to move, quiet conversations filled the room. Some spoke about schedules and work. Others spoke about the boy. No one laughed this time. The judge remained seated as the room emptied. He rested his elbows on the desk and looked at the piano against the wall. He hadn't noticed it in years. It had always been there, ignored, collecting dust. He wondered how many people had passed it without ever hearing what it could do. A memory surfaced from long ago. He had been young once too, sitting in a crowded room, wishing someone would listen. He had chosen law because he believed it could protect people. Somewhere along the way, paperwork and pressure had buried that belief. He stood and walked toward the piano. His fingers hovered over the keys, then pulled back. He didn't play. He just stood there, letting the quiet remind him of something he had almost forgotten. Out in the hallway, the boy waited. Time moved slowly. His parent eventually arrived, breathless and worried. Questions came fast, but the boy only answered what he could. He didn't know how to explain what had happened. He just said it was okay now. They were told they could leave. As they walked outside, sunlight hit the boy's face. He squinted, not used to the sudden brightness. The world felt wide and open. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel small inside it. That evening, the boy lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling. The room was quiet except for distant street sounds. His fingers moved slightly on the blanket, pressing invisible keys. The music returned in his head, steady and calm. The next day, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived. It was simple and official, with careful words and clear instructions. Someone from the court had reached out to a local community center. They had mentioned a child who showed unusual ability and needed guidance, not discipline. The boy didn't fully understand the letter, but he understood what mattered. There was a place where he could play. The community center was small, but it felt warm. The piano there wasn't perfect either. Some keys were stiff. Some sounded tired. But when the boy sat down, it felt right. An older instructor watched quietly from a distance. No one rushed him. No one corrected him. They let him play. Music filled the room again. Not loud, not showy, but honest. Other children gathered slowly, listening. Some sat beside him. Some swayed gently. No one told him to stop. Back at the courthouse, the judge returned to his routine, but something had shifted. He began asking more questions. He listened longer. He noticed the people behind the cases. The piano stayed where it was, but it was no longer ignored. Sometimes, during breaks, someone would press a few keys. The sound reminded them of that day. Weeks passed. The boy continued to play. His hands grew more confident. His world grew wider. He still struggled with words, but he learned that he didn't always need them. One afternoon, after practice, he paused and looked at the keys beneath his fingers. He remembered the courtroom, the judge's voice, the silence that followed the last note. He smiled softly. The world hadn't changed completely. Life was still hard. Money was still tight. Days were still long. But something inside him had opened. And once something opens, it's hard to close it again. The boy's life did not suddenly turn into a perfect story. Days were still busy. Some mornings were rushed. Some nights were quiet and long. But there was a new rhythm now, something steady that followed him wherever he went. He continued visiting the community center after school. The walk there became familiar. He learned which streets were loud and which were calm. He learned when to slow down and when to hurry. Each step felt lighter than before. Inside the center, the piano waited. At first, he played only when asked. He stayed careful, afraid that too much attention might make the music disappear. But the instructor encouraged him gently, never pushing, never rushing. The boy learned that music could grow without losing its meaning. Other children listened. Some asked questions. Some didn't. It didn't matter. The boy played for himself first. Everything else came second. At home, things stayed mostly the same. Money was still tight. Work was still hard. But his parents noticed small changes. He slept better. He smiled more. When words failed him, he no longer grew frustrated. He simply moved his fingers in the air, as if shaping invisible notes. One evening, he brought home a small keyboard from the center. It was old and missing a few buttons, but it worked. He placed it carefully on a table that wobbled slightly. That night, the house filled with soft sound instead of silence. His parents stood in the doorway listening. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. At the courthouse, the judge carried on with his work. The days remained long. The cases remained many. But the way he listened had changed. He found himself pausing more often, looking up more often, asking people to explain instead of cutting them off. He still believed in rules, but he remembered now that rules were meant to serve people, not erase them. Sometimes, during late afternoons, the judge would walk past the piano and stop. He never played. He simply stood there, hands behind his back, remembering the sound that had once filled the room. That sound had followed him home too. One night, he sat alone at his desk, reading through old files. He came across cases that felt unfinished, not because of the verdicts, but because of the way they had been handled. He closed the file and leaned back, letting the quiet settle. He knew he could not fix everything, but he could listen. Months passed. The boy grew taller. His hands stretched farther across the keys. The music changed with him. It became stronger, more confident, but it never lost its honesty. He learned structure, but he never forgot feeling. One afternoon, the community center hosted a small gathering. Nothing formal, just neighbors, chairs, and quiet smiles. The boy sat at the piano, heart racing just a little. He looked out at the faces, then down at the keys. He played. The room filled with sound, and once again people leaned forward. Once again time slowed. Afterward, there was no loud applause, just gentle claps, nods, warm looks, the kind of response that didn't demand anything more. The boy stepped away from the piano and felt proud, not because others had listened, but because he had been heard. Later that evening, as he walked home, he passed a public building. Through the window, he saw a piano resting quietly in a corner. For a moment he stopped and watched it. He didn't go inside. He smiled and kept walking. Back at the courthouse, the piano was cleaned regularly now. Sometimes it was played during community events. Sometimes it sat silent. But it was no longer invisible. People remembered. They remembered the day a small boy had been told he was wasting time, only to show them what time could hold. The judge never saw the boy again, and that was okay. Some stories are not meant to continue face to face. Some are meant to move quietly through lives, leaving marks where they pass. Years later, someone would mention music in a courtroom, and the judge would smile without explaining why. And somewhere else, a young person would sit at a piano, press a key, and feel understood. The world did not change all at once. But in one room on one day it paused long enough to listen. And that made all the difference.